Hi, my name is Teresa Bolger and I am a consultant archaeologist working with Rubicon Heritage Services. This is the second in a series of talks about archaeology in the context of construction projects and development control. Our previous talk outlined what archaeology is, why it's important, and the legal framework for its protection. This talk will focus on archaeology in the planning process. In our last talk, we outlined the Irish legislation that protects archaeology: the National Monuments Acts, the National Cultural Institutions Act, the Heritage Act, and the key piece of legislation when it comes to looking at archaeology in the planning process, the Planning and Development Acts. While the other legislation does come into play, it's the Planning and Development Acts that fundamentally determine when and how archaeology needs to be factored into the planning process. So the first thing we should look at are the key provisions for archaeology in the Planning and Development Acts. What do the Acts allow or require? The designation and general protection of various monument and object types is primarily dealt with in the other pieces of legislation. However, the Planning and Development Acts do deal with the formal designation of two protected classes: protected structures and architectural conservation areas. Though these are mainly associated with built heritage, the legal definition for what can be included in both designations includes archaeology. Upstanding archaeological sites in particular are commonly added to the record of protected structures in addition to their other legal designations. The Act set out the legal framework for the designation, protection and management of these two protected classes. The Act set out formal requirements for capturing and defining planning policy and objectives at a number of different levels. This runs from local area plans to county development plans to regional guidance to the National Planning Framework, which was added in the 2018 amendment. The legislation requires that these include specific objectives in relation to the conservation and protection of the environment, including in particular archaeological and natural heritage, the protection of structures or parts of structures which are of special architectural, historical, archaeological, artistic, cultural, scientific, social, or technical interest, the preservation of the character of archaeological conservation areas. So protection for archaeology and heritage must be built into planning policy at all levels. Applications for planning permission and proposed strategic or infrastructure developments are then evaluated against these policy positions. Certain types of development require environmental impact assessments, which are then presented as part of the application for planning permission. The requirements and standards for environmental impact assessment are set out in a series of successive EU directives. The Planning and Development Acts include provisions for EIA which transpose EU directives into Irish law. Potential impacts to architectural heritage, archaeology and cultural heritage are all factors that must be assessed within a properly conducted EIA. This is set out in the original directives and our subsequent legislation, as well as being incorporated into the relevant standards and guidance for EIA in Ireland issued by the Environmental Protection Agency. The Act allows planning authorities to include conditions in any approved grant of planning permission. These conditions can include any condition relating to the preservation, either in situ or by record, of places, caves, sites, features, or other objects of archaeological, geological, historical, scientific, or ecological interest. This means that grants of permission can include binding requirements in relation to archaeology. These can result in changes to the approved design or requirements for specific archaeological works or interventions prior to or in conjunction with construction. Unacceptable impacts to archaeology or built heritage are also legally permissible reasons for the rejection of a planning application. The Act specify that the Minister for Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht is a statutory consultee. This means that the Minister can issue guidance to planning authorities in relation to the protection of archaeology and built heritage, advise on changes to the record of protected structures and the definition of architectural conservation areas, to the additions or deletions to these. Most importantly, the Minister can make recommendations in relation to planning applications. So what does this all mean in practice? All strategic planning documents will include specific policies and objectives in relation to the protection of archaeology. You will find these in your local area plan or county development plan. Typical examples of such a policy might include to protect archaeological material in situ by ensuring that only minimal impact on archaeological layers is allowed by way of the reuse of buildings, light buildings, foundation design, or the omission of basements in zones of archaeological interest. Or to ensure archaeological remains are identified and fully considered at the very earliest stages of the development process, that schemes are designed to avoid impacting on the archaeological heritage. Each time these plans are reviewed and updated, the policies and objectives in relation to archaeology are also reviewed and updated to reflect current best practice. In considering a planning application, it's important to be familiar with the specific policies for your county or local area, as applications are assessed against them. As already outlined, the Minister for Culture, Heritage and the Gaeltacht is a statutory consultee on applications for planning. In practice, it is the professional staff of the National Monument Service who evaluate and issue advice or guidance in relation to archaeological issues. However, a number of local authorities do retain their own archaeologist in-house, usually based within the planning section, to provide more immediate advice. Examples include Dublin City Council, Fingal County Council, Cork City and County Council, Kerry, Limerick and Mayo County Councils. It's usually possible to find out from the County Council website if your local authority employs one. If you are considering a planning application and have concerns about archaeology, it's usually possible to contact them to get some informal advice before you submit an application. There are also established codes of practice between the Minister and a range of state agencies and semi-state bodies which set out how each of these entities will deal with archaeology in the context of the various types of infrastructure development within their individual remits. So what types of sites in proposed developments are likely to have to deal with archaeological requirements? Infrastructure developments are an obvious candidate, but really the range and type of proposed development is extremely broad, both greenfield and brownfield sites, as well as large and small scale sites that can range from a house extension or one-off build to a large housing estate or industrial site. Each individual site or proposed development needs to be assessed on its own merits. But two important factors that can influence whether any planning application is carefully scrutinised for potential impacts to archaeology are proximity to previously identified archaeological sites, monuments or areas of archaeological potential, as well as the scale and character of the proposed development. So when should you seek advice about archaeology in relation to a proposed development? The simple answer is as soon as possible. The earlier you recognise heritage issues, the less it ultimately costs. A significant proportion of construction projects will have potential impacts on archaeology. If you are considering purchasing land for the purposes of development, even if it is only very small scale, a one-off house or the like, then you should make some inquiries about archaeology. This will allow you to make an informed decision on the purchase and to identify what potential costs for archaeology might need to be factored into your development budget. Definitely, potential impacts to archaeology and heritage are something that you should assess and evaluate at design stage when you are designing your development and well in advance of a formal application for planning permission. When archaeological issues are identified at this early stage, there is a much greater scope to design around them, to adjust your development design so that impacts to archaeology and heritage are either avoided entirely or kept to a minimum. So, are there tangible benefits to considering archaeological issues at this early stage? Firstly, it controls risk. Archaeology can be a significant project risk item in construction. Early intervention and engagement, as with any other project risk, is the best way to manage and control this. Secondly, it can save you money. All costs for carrying out archaeological works in relation to any development are borne by the person or organisation carrying out the development. There are no grant aids or subsidies. Early intervention and engagement allows for any necessary archaeological works to be delivered efficiently and in a controlled manner, without knock-on effects to other areas of programme and budget. The opportunity to design out the risk at an early stage also offers cost benefits. Further to this, it helps you avoid unexpected delays and expensive conflicts at construction stage. An evaluation of any potential archaeological and heritage impacts and a clear mitigation strategy can strengthen a planning application and avoid requests for further information that can slow the process. Protections for archaeology and heritage are hard-coded into our planning system. All the heritage legislation must be legally complied with. So really, there is no advantage to deferring engagement with any potential archaeological issues a planned development might have. So in this talk, we have outlined how archaeology fits into the planning process. Our previous talk outlining what archaeology is, why it is considered important, and the legislation protecting it is available for you to watch. Please check back again soon for more talks in this series. Upcoming talks will explain archaeological methods and practices, look at risk management for archaeology and construction projects as well as construction contracts, outline what is involved in post-excavation analysis and why it is a critical part of the archaeological process. If you want to find out more about archaeology in the planning process, however, there is a list of links to further resources on our blog post for this talk.